When I first arrived at her house, I didn't expect much more than a dusty screen. Maybe a few virus pop-ups and a hard drive on its last breath. Just another call from the community board. I was the go-to tech guy for simple home fixes. In our small suburban town, a side gig I picked up after college while figuring out what to do with my computer science degree. People liked me because I was polite, affordable, and didn't make them feel dumb for not knowing how to use their own machines. It was a warm Wednesday morning when I rang the bell of a modest, ivy-clad townhouse tucked between two larger, more modern homes. A wind chime danced above the door, playing a gentle tune that almost made me forget I was there for work. Then, the door opened. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. She stood there with a warm but tired smile, as if she had just returned from a long journey only she knew about. Maybe in her early 50s, though she held herself with the poise of someone who had seen decades of storms and survived them all. Her hair was neatly tied in a low bun, a few silvery strands catching the light. She wore a soft lilac sweater, faded at the elbows, and held a pair of reading glasses in one hand. Her voice was calm, deliberate, and slightly raspy when she said, "You must be the computer guy." I nodded, lifting my small toolkit in response, and she motioned for me to come in. Her name was Margaret. I learned that within minutes of stepping into her home, everything inside looked as though it had been kept just the way it was meant to. B-books stacked neatly, a vase of fresh flowers on the coffee table, family photos arranged with precision across the mantelpiece. Yet the air held a silence I didn't expect. Not the kind of silence that fills a quiet house, but the kind that lingers when laughter hasn't lived there in a long time. I followed her through a narrow hallway lined with faded wallpaper to a small study tucked in the back of the house. The computer sat at the center of an oak desk that looked older than me, flanked by shelves of books, journals, and framed certificates. She gave me a brief explanation about how it had started freezing, locking her out of emails, and how she hadn't been able to video call her sister for weeks. She sounded apologetic, like it was her fault the machine had stopped functioning. I smiled and reassured her I'd take care of it. She nodded and quietly stepped back, folding herself into an armchair in the corner with a cup of tea. As I ran diagnostics and worked through the software glitches, I found myself stealing occasional glances at her. She wasn't watching me. She was staring out the window at the garden beyond, but her expression wasn't blank. It was searching, like she was waiting for something to arrive from the other side of the trees. Every so often, she'd speak softly, not really to me, more like to herself. "I used to love this room," she murmured at one point. "It used to be filled with people. I didn't want to intrude, but something about her tone made me respond." "Looks like it still holds a lot of memories," I said, hoping to keep things casual. She turned to look at me then, and there was a flicker of something behind her eyes. Not surprise exactly. Recognition, maybe. Like I'd just said something she didn't expect to hear from someone like me. Someone younger, a stranger really. Crouched next to her desk, fiddling with wires and windows. "I used to host writing groups here," she said eventually. "And art classes for kids. It was lively once." Her voice trembled ever so slightly. "But life got quieter over the years." I nodded, not sure what to say. So I focused back on the screen. But in my chest, something shifted. I wasn't just fixing a computer. I was in the presence of someone whose life had stretched far beyond mine. Someone whose quiet house was louder with meaning than most places I'd ever stepped into. I checked her browser history, her files, her apps. It's nothing malicious, no viruses, just an old hard drive and a few outdated programs. I'd need about another hour to finish cleaning it up, and I told her so. She offered me tea, which I declined. At first, then accepted after she insisted. We sat quietly, sipping together in that small study. Though I hadn't said much, I felt as if we were slowly stepping into the same rhythm. She told me about her sister who lived out of state, and how they hadn't seen each other since before the pandemic. She spoke about her husband who had passed away a decade ago, and how she hadn't bothered replacing the computer until a friend convinced her to. There was a softness to her, She spoke layered beneath years of solitude. But what struck me most was how she looked at me when I told her I'd almost given up this kind of work to take a job in the city. "You shouldn't," she said firmly. "You bring calm into rooms. That's rare. Don't give that up." I smiled awkwardly, brushing it off. But something about the way she said it made me feel like she saw something I hadn't quite discovered in myself yet. The sun had dipped a little lower by the time I finished the repairs. I installed a lighter, OS, optimized the settings, and cleared up storage. The machine was running smoother than it had in years. When I showed her the changes and offered to walk her through some shortcuts, she looked at the screen like it was an old friend returning. "From a long trip, you've done more than fix it," she said. "You've given it back to me." And then, just as I was packing up my bag and getting ready to leave, she stood up, walked over to the window, and looked out once more. I thought she was going to say goodbye. Instead, she turned back toward me, the late afternoon light catching her face just right, and said in a low voice, "You're the first in my 45 years to whom I'd show my true self." I froze. I didn't know what she meant exactly, but her voice was steady, her eyes clear. And in that moment, the house didn't feel silent anymore. It felt like it was just beginning to speak. I should have said something back. Anything but. All I could do was stand there, the weight of her words hanging in the space between us. They weren't flirtatious. They weren't even dramatic. Were honest, almost too honest, as if she'd been saving that sentence for someone who could finally hold it without breaking. I nodded, not out of politeness, but because I didn't. Trust my voice not to crack. Then she smiled, not the small, tight one she wore when I first arrived. This one was real, soft, unguarded. It made her look years younger. "I'm sorry," she said after a few seconds. That probably sounded strange. But I didn't think it was strange. I knew it wasn't. I told her as much. "Not strange at all," I replied, slowly zipping up my toolkit, just unexpected. She tilted her head as if considering whether to believe me. Then she laughed lightly and motioned to the hallway. "Would you like to see the garden before you go?" It made me say yes, though I was technically finished and had another appointment in an hour. We walked out the back door, through a small porch, and into what looked like a slice of a forgotten fairy tale. The garden was overgrown, but in a poetic way. Ivy curled up the fence posts, lavender and rosemary bushes spilled from stone planters, and in the far corner was a bench half swallowed by wildflowers. It was breathtaking, not because it was pristine, but because it was alive, unfiltered, and deeply personal. She sat on the bench, gesturing for me to join her. Disused. "To be my sanctuary," she said after a pause. "When things got too loud or too quiet, I'd sit here for hours, sometimes with a book, sometimes just listening to the wind." I glanced at her profile. There was a faraway look in her eyes again, like she was seeing the garden as it had been a long time ago. I asked her if she still came out here often. She shook her head. "Not as much lately. I suppose I stopped letting myself enjoy the things I loved." Her voice dropped lower. Or maybe I just didn't want to feel alone in them. I felt a knot form in my chest. Not out of pity. Margaret didn't need pity, because I recognized something in her I'd seen in others before, and maybe in myself on darker days. That quiet kind of loneliness that doesn't always look like sadness. The kind that settles into your routines until you forget what it felt like to be truly seen. We sat in silence for a while, and it wasn't uncomfortable. It was still like the air was giving her space to breathe freely for once. When she turned to look at me again, her expression was unreadable. Then she asked me something I didn't expect. "Do you mind staying a bit longer? I can make coffee or tea again." Normally I would have politely declined. My schedule was tight, and I had never stayed past a job unless there was more work. But something about the way she said it felt different. Not needy, not desperate, just open. And I realized I didn't want to leave yet either. "Sure," I said. "Coffee sounds great." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Back inside the house felt warmer than before. Maybe it was the late afternoon sun bleeding through the windows. Or maybe it was just that I wasn't there as a stranger anymore. She moved about the kitchen with a quiet confidence, measuring grounds, heating the kettle, pulling pulling out two mismatched mugs. One had a faded print of a sunflower, the other Red World's okayest cook. She handed me the latter with a half smile. "It's accurate," she said, and we both laughed. We sat at the small kitchen table, and she told me more about herself, pieces of her life offered gently, like flipping through pages of an old diary. She used to teach literature at the community college. She painted watercolors for a while, and even sold a few in town galleries. She'd been married once, for almost 15 years, to a man who, she said, loved the idea of her more than the real her. They parted quietly. No yelling, just a slow unraveling of two people who stopped speaking the same language. "He wasn't cruel," she said, sipping her coffee, "but he never really saw me. I think I got used to that, and then I stopped showing myself." It was easier. Her words sank deep. I wondered how many people walk through life like that, simmering beneath the surface, hiding the parts of themselves that felt too complicated, too inconvenient, too unlovable. I didn't know what to say that wouldn't sound like a Hallmark card, so I just said what I felt. "That sounds incredibly lonely." She looked at me then, and her eyes shimmered not with tears, but with recognition. "It is," she said. "It really is." There was no drama in her tone, just truth. We fell into a quiet again, but this one was different. There was a mutual understanding now, a thread that connected to unlikely people in a moment neither of us could have planned for. I glanced at the time, realizing I should have left 30 minutes ago. I told her I had to head out soon, but could stop by next week to check if the updates held. She smiled and nodded, her fingers gently tapping the rim of her mug. "I'd like that," she said. "And maybe next time I'll show you something." I haven't shared with anyone in years. I didn't know what she meant, but the sincerity in her voice told me it mattered. Deeply, I promised to return. As I walked to the front door, toolkit in hand, she followed me there. Just before I stepped outside, she paused, as if trying to decide something. Then she placed a hand lightly on my arm and said, "Thank you for not rushing. Most people don't stay long enough to really see anything." I didn't have to ask what she meant by anything. I felt it. And somehow, as I stepped back into the afternoon light, I realized I wasn't just fixing machines anymore. Something else had started to shift, subtle but real. I didn't know where it was heading, but I knew one thing for sure. I would be back. It was hard to explain why I kept thinking about her that night. Maybe it was her voice, quiet and composed, yet filled with things she hadn't said aloud in a long time. Maybe it was the way she looked at me when she said I was the first in 45 years. That number echoed in my mind like it carried weight. Far heavier than it sounded. I told myself it was just another job. That I was just a tech guy doing a good deed for a lonely woman who hadn't had real company in a while. But the truth was, something about Margaret stayed with me, and that was new. The following Tuesday, I found myself back at her front porch without needing to check the GPS. I remembered the chime over her door, the uneven step on the walkway, even the smell of rosemary that wafted in from the garden. I rang the bell and waited. This time, the door opened faster, and she smiled as though she'd been expecting more than just a repairman. "You came back," she said, not as a question, but with a soft sort of surprise. I smiled and lifted. "My toolkit again. Told you I would." Inside, the house felt lighter somehow. Or maybe I was just more aware of its details now, the way the sunlight came in through the lace curtains. The subtle hum of a clock from the study, the smell of cinnamon that lingered faintly in the air. She offered tea before I could even unpack my tools, and this time I didn't hesitate. "I baked too," she added, almost shyly. "It's just banana bread. Not great, but decent." She was wrong. It was more than decent. The warm slice she handed me with tea was soft and fragrant, with that nostalgic taste that only homemade food carries. We sat in the study again while I ran a few post-install updates and ensured everything was still running smoothly. She watched me quietly for a while, sipping from her mug, before finally speaking. "I almost didn't call you back," she said. "I was worried I'd imagined how kind you were last time, that maybe I'd just been lonely and made more of it than it was." I looked up from the screen and met her eyes. "You didn't imagine anything," I told her. I don't fake kindness. And I wouldn't have come back if I didn't mean to. She looked away, but I saw her shoulders ease just slightly, like she had been bracing for rejection and was finally beginning to exhale. While updates processed, she pulled out a box from the corner of the room and opened it on the floor beside her chair. Inside were old photographs, some black and white, some faded with age, others with curled corners and smudged dates on the back. She didn't ask if I wanted to see them. She just began showing me. A younger version of her in a sun hat by the sea. A candid shot of her sketching something beside a window. A group photo of smiling students holding books, with Margaret in the center. That was my first class, she said, pointing. They gave me hell, but I loved every one of them. There was pride in her voice, but also a longing that clung to the edges of each sentence. As she turned through more photos, I noticed the subtle change in her expressions, how she touched certain ones longer, or how her thumb lingered over the corner of a torn picture with only half a face visible. "Who's that?" I asked gently. She didn't answer at first, then softly, "My sister. That's the last photo I have of her before she left." We stopped speaking for reasons that seemed smaller now. Her voice trembled slightly. "I don't know if we'll talk again." I think I was just too angry back then. There wasn't anything to fix in that moment. No setting to click, no software to patch, just silence to hold. I stayed quiet, letting her feel what she needed to feel. She looked up and gave me a tiny, almost guilty smile. I don't usually open up like this, not even with people I've known for decades. I offered her the only thing I could. My presence, honest and unjudging. "Sometimes it's easier with someone new," I said. Someone. With no expectations of who you're supposed to be. She seemed to take that in deeply, nodding once before gently closing the box of photos. Later, when the computer restarted, she leaned back in her chair and let out a breath like she'd been holding it for years. "Everything works now," she said, almost in disbelief. "It's like the machine has a new life." I smiled and replied, "Sometimes it just needs a little cleanup and someone willing to be patient with it." I didn't realize how much those words mirrored what she had probably been longing to hear for herself. She did, though. And I saw that in the way she looked at me, not romantically, not longingly, but with a kind of reverence that humbled me. Before I packed up, she hesitated at the doorway and said, "Do you want to see the attic next time? There's something up there I think you should see." I raised an eyebrow, curious, but didn't press her. "Sure," I said. "Whenever you're ready." She smiled wider this time, and for the first time, I saw a glimmer of something brighter behind her eyes. Not sadness, not nostalgia, the first spark of someone remembering who they used to be. As I walked back to my car, toolkit in hand, I realized the days I spent with her weren't just part of a service call. They were becoming chapters in a story I hadn't planned to be part of. And as strange as it seemed, I was okay with that, because in fixing her computer, I was starting to see parts of her she had forgotten were worth showing. And maybe, just maybe, I was beginning to uncover pieces of myself too. The days stretched into a quiet rhythm after that second visit. But something about her invitation lingered with me. She'd mentioned the attic, said there was something she wanted to show me, and that alone carried weight-tan, unspoken significance that pressed gently on my thoughts as the week went on. I wasn't sure what I expected. Maybe a dusty collection of books, or forgotten paintings, or perhaps just more of those worn-down photo boxes, but I knew it wasn't about the object itself. It was about her wanting someone there to see it. Wanting me there? When I showed up on Saturday afternoon, the air was warmer than usual, thick with the kind of humidity that made everything feel slow and deliberate. Margaret answered the door in a loose linen blouse, her silver hair pinned up casually. She looked like someone caught between elegance and comfort, and somehow that suited her. She didn't offer tea this time. Instead, she smiled and simply said, "Come on, it's time." We climbed the narrow wooden staircase just off the study, each step creaking under our feet. The walls leading up to the attic were lined with framed sketches, some of still life, others abstract swirls of color and emotion. I paused in front of one that looked like a storm breaking over the sea, drawn in charcoal and hints of faded blue pastel. "Yours?" I asked, already knowing the answer. She nodded but kept walking. The attic door groaned as she pushed it open, revealing a space filled with soft natural light filtered through a circular window at the far end. Dust floated in the air, dancing in the sunbeams like lazy snowflakes. There were boxes, of course, and old furniture draped in white cloth. But against the far wall, propped on an easel, was a large canvas. She walked over to it, gently lifting the sheet that covered it, revealing a portrait that made my breath catch for a second. It was her, or it had been. Younger, yes, but unmistakably. Margaret is fierce, mouth soft, shoulders straight, like someone prepared to carry more than her share of the world. The brushstrokes were confident, textured, almost alive. Around her figure, the background was chaos, shadows, and motion, suggestions of people, places, moments, trying to break through. "I painted this when I was 32, she said, her voice barely louder than the wind against the attic window. "Right before I quit, right before everything became about responsibilities and survival." I stood in silence, taking in the power of the image. It wasn't perfect technically, but it didn't need to be. It was raw, real, the kind of self-portrait that spoke of who someone believed they were meant to be before life wore them down. "Why'd you stop?" I finally asked. She laughed softly, but there was no joy in it. "Because my ex-husband told me I needed to grow up, that art was a phase, that I wasn't talented enough to make it matter. And eventually, I started believing him." She glanced at me, then back at the painting. "Isn't it strange how we can forget who we are just because someone else said we shouldn't be that person anymore?" I wanted to say something comforting, something profound, but the only thing that came out was the truth. "I think you're still her," I said. "Maybe hidden under some dust and years. But she's still here." That made her pause. Not with surprise, but with something like gratitude. She reached out and touched the canvas lightly, like she hadn't done so in a long time. "That's why I asked you up here," she said after a moment. "Not for the painting itself, but because I needed someone to see it. It's to see me, and I couldn't think of anyone else I'd trust with that." It was a strange thing to feel so deeply moved by someone you barely knew, and yet feel like you understood them better than people you'd known for years. I wasn't in love with her. This wasn't that kind of story. But I cared deeply. About what happened to her, about whether or not she rediscovered that person in the portrait. And maybe, in some corner of my heart, I wished someone would look at me one day and see that deeply too. We spent the rest of the afternoon in that attic. She showed me old sketchbooks filled with fragmented thoughts and half-finished ideas. Poems she'd written on the backs of receipts. Notes from students she had mentored who had gone on to become artists or designers or just happier people. She spoke of her regrets like they were old friends familiar, but no longer in control. And I listened, not because I was trying to be polite, but because her stories mattered. Before I left, she handed me a small envelope. "I want you to have this," she said. "Don't open it until you get home." I nodded, not questioning the request. As I stepped outside, the sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows across her porch. There was something peaceful about that moment, like the universe was giving both of us permission to slow down, to breathe. When I got home, I opened the envelope. Inside was a photo, not of her, but of a painting one I hadn't seen in the attic. It was abstract, filled with light and color, like joy exploding out of the canvas. On the back, in neat handwriting, she'd written, "I made this on the day I first believed in myself again." But you were part of that. I sat with that for a long time, the photo resting in my hands. I didn't know what came next. Maybe I'd see her again next week. Maybe she'd call with another excuse to invite me over. Or maybe this was just a chapter, one that changed both of us quietly and permanently. Whatever it was, I was grateful. Not just for the job or the tea, or even the stories, but for being seen. And for seeing her in return. The following Monday, I was sitting in my small apartment with my laptop open but untouched. The job queue had new tickets piling up, customers waiting on installations and updates, but my mind kept circling back to Margaret. Not out of obligation. And not because I was trying to analyze anything just curiosity. Something in her energy stayed with me. like a song you hum days after hearing it. Her presence was gentle but persistent, like the scent of something, comforting that lingers in a room even after someone leaves. I wasn't sure what that meant or where it was heading, but I knew I didn't want to pretend it didn't exist. I didn't want to impose, so I waited until the middle of the week to message her. Just something simple. Hey Margaret, just checking in. Hope everything's running smoothly with the system. Let me know if you need anything. The dots appeared immediately, then vanished, then returned. When the message finally came through, it was one line. Actually, would you mind stopping by this Friday? Something's come up. No smiley face. No details. Just that. But I knew her well enough now to recognize the tone. This wasn't a system update. This was something else. I arrived late Friday morning, toolkit in hand out of habit even though I had a gut feeling it wouldn't be needed. Margaret opened the door with a soft expression, her cardigan slightly misaligned and her usually neat hair loose around her shoulders. She didn't say much, just moved aside so I could enter and motioned toward the kitchen. The air inside the house felt heavier, not sad exactly, but full of thought, like someone had been pacing in it for hours. She poured us both coffee, though. Hers remained untouched on the counter. I followed her into the living room where she sat on the edge of the couch, a folder resting on her lap. I debated whether or not to show you this, she said without looking up. But if there's anyone who won't twist it, I think it's you. She handed me the folder. Inside were several pages of typed writing, stapled and numbered. The title at the top of the first page read, Draft 1, When the Mirror Doesn't Recognize Me. I looked up and she was already watching me, gauging my reaction like it might determine something important. It's a memoir, she said after a moment. Well, pieces of one. I started writing it years ago, but never had the nerve to finish. I always figured, who would care? Who was I to take up space on a shelf with my story? Her fingers fidgeted with the edge of her sleeve. But after you came by, something changed. You asked nothing of me and yet saw more than people who've been around for decades. I started writing again that night. I felt the weight of the folder in my hands and realized it wasn't just paper, it was a lifetime. Her words, her truths, her voice on every page. Can I read it? I asked. She nodded, hesitating just long enough that I knew it meant more than she let on. I sat down and began reading aloud, not just to hear the words but to give them life. In the room. The opening lines were about childhood, a shy girl who loved to read under the staircase and once tried to run away with a suitcase full of books and crackers. I smiled. Margaret laughed quietly. I made it to the end of the street. Before I got scared and came back, as I continued, the tone shifted. She wrote about college, about falling in love too quickly and staying too long, about teaching students who showed her glimpses of herself she had long buried, about the years when her home felt like a shell, echoing with expectations she never truly agreed to. She was raw and honest, admitting to both selfishness and self-sacrifice, strength and avoidance. There were moments I had to stop reading because my voice caught on the lump forming in my throat. When I finally looked up, her eyes were glassy but steady. I never thought I'd hear someone else speak my story back to me, she said. Terrifying. But it also makes me feel real in a way I haven't in a long time. I set the folder down and leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. This needs to be finished, I said. Not just for you. For anyone who thinks their story doesn't matter. She gave me a look I couldn't quite describe, part gratitude, part disbelief, part something deeper she hadn't decided to name yet. We didn't talk much after that. There was no need to. I helped her move some boxes later in the afternoon. Nothing major. Just enough to feel useful. She made lunch, and we sat at the table like old friends who'd weathered some quiet storm together. As I was getting ready to leave, she handed me a small flash drive. It has everything I've written so far. I don't know why I'm giving it to you, but ... keep it for me. Just in case I talk myself out of this again. I nodded, slipping it into my jacket pocket with care. The drive home was quiet, but my head buzzed with thoughts. Not about technology or bills or my usual list of daily tasks, but about courage. It's about what it meant to show someone your unfinished self and trust they'd handle it with care. Margaret had done that. Now somehow I had a part to play. in helping her keep going. I didn't know if I was ready for that responsibility, but I knew I wouldn't take it lightly. Later that night, plugged in the flash drive. Her folder appeared on my screen, titled simply M Drafts. I opened the first file and began to read again, not as a favor, not as a project, but because it felt like something sacred. It's like witnessing a person finding their voice in real time, and I wanted to be there for every sentence of it. The days that followed had a strange weight to them. Not heavy in a burdensome way, but in the way that something meaningful hangs quietly in the background of everything you do. I went about my usual routines, troubleshooting, client calls, software installs, but my mind kept drifting back to the flash drive in my pocket. Every night after dinner and a quick scroll through unread emails, I'd open it and read another section of Margaret's writing. And every night, it was like peeling back a curtain just a little more to see someone not only trying to understand herself, but daring to let someone else witness the attempt. Her writing was raw and unfiltered, more so than I expected. She didn't try to dress it up. There were typos, abrupt paragraph breaks, notes to herself in the margins, like rewrite this later or don't be so dramatic. But it was beautiful because of that. She let herself be messy on the page, and somehow that mess painted the clearest picture of who she really was. I started leaving notes in the margins of the Word documents, not suggestions, just thoughts. Things like "this part hit hard," or "I think this is the moment your voice really shines." I wasn't editing. I was responding like a conversation through time and drafts. By the end of the week, I had a text from Margaret. "Coffee this weekend? I'm feeling braver." I replied yes, without hesitation. And early Saturday morning, I found myself standing at her door again, this time with no tools, no job to do, just me in jeans and a hoodie, hands in my pockets. She opened the door, smiling, her eyes brighter than they'd been before. "I bought those little cinnamon rolls you mentioned last time. I figured you'd earned a treat." We sat on her back patio this time, a space I hadn't seen before. It was small but cozy, lined with potted succulents and a tiny herb garden on the railing. The sunlight came through the trees in scattered streaks, warming the space just enough to make jackets unnecessary. She poured the coffee, and we sat in a silence that was comfortable, not awkward. After a few minutes, she spoke. "I read your comments." I glanced over. She didn't look nervous, just ... thoughtful.
No.
"I didn't expect you to read all of it so quickly," she said, tapping her fingers against her mug. "I thought maybe you'd skim a few chapters and then quietly avoid bringing it up again." I shook my head. "You don't give yourself enough credit. It's good. Not just good for someone who isn't a writer. It's honest. And that makes it powerful." She didn't say anything for a moment, then gave a soft laugh. "You know, the first person I ever showed a piece of that to told me it was too emotional, that it wouldn't connect with people." I put it. Away for 6 years after that. Her voice cracked on that last word just a little, and I felt something catch in my chest. "Then they didn't know what they were talking about," I said quietly. "People connect with truth, Margaret. Even when it's uncomfortable, maybe especially when it is." She looked over at me, studying me like she was still deciding. If she could trust my words, then she nodded slowly and sipped her coffee. We spent most of the morning talking about her manuscript, what she still wanted to write, but she was afraid to say, and what she thought didn't matter but probably did. I told her she had every right to tell her story. Not because it was more tragic or dramatic than anyone else's, but because it was hers. And because every time someone speaks their truth, it gives someone else permission to do the same. Eventually, the conversation shifted. She started asking about really asking, not just the surface-level things people ask out of politeness. She wanted to know what made me tick, what I did when I wasn't working, what my relationship with my parents was like, why I still hadn't dated anyone seriously in a few years. And for some reason, I told her. All of it. I didn't sugarcoat or dodge or turn it into a joke like I usually did. She listened with the kind of attention that made you feel like you were saying something that mattered. When I told her about the last girl I was serious about, the one who said I was too much in my head and always looking for the exit, Margaret just nodded. Sounds like she wanted a mirror, not a person. That line stuck with me. I hadn't thought of it like that, but she was right. And as strange as it was, hearing that from a woman twice my age didn't make it weird. It made it feel safe. Sun had moved higher by then, casting long shadows across the patio. I helped her bring the cups in, and as I was heading toward the door, she touched my arm gently. I don't know if I ever said thank you. For reading, for seeing me. I looked at her hand, soft and steady against my sleeve, and then at her eyes. You don't have to thank me. I'm glad you let me. She didn't pull her hand away right away. For a second I felt something shift. Not in a romantic way, not yet anyway, but in that subtle recalibration that happens when two people start to truly trust each other. I went home that evening with a bag of leftover cinnamon rolls and an invitation to return the following week. To talk structure and style, as she put it. But I knew it was more than that. We were building something, not just a story, not just an understanding, but something that neither of us could fully name yet. Name it. I just knew I wanted to keep showing up that night. As I stared at the ceiling above my bed, I realized something that startled me. This wasn't about fixing her computer anymore. It never really was. That machine brought us together. Sure, but what kept me coming back wasn't the screen or the system. It was her courage, her quiet strength, the way she handed me pieces of herself like they were fragile glass and trusted I wouldn't drop them. And somehow, in all of it, I was starting to feel seen too. The following Saturday morning felt different. Not because anything specific had changed, but because I felt it in myself. There was this quiet eagerness I hadn't expected, a sort of internal hum that started the moment I woke up. I even took more time getting ready, shaved properly, ironed my shirt, and made sure my hair didn't do that annoying swoop thing it tended to do when I didn't pay attention. I told myself it wasn't for her. Not really. It was out of respect. Out of the strange sense of anticipation I felt, heading into something that had slowly started to matter more than I'd intended. When I arrived at her house, door before I could even knock, like she'd been standing just beyond it, she wore a navy sweater with the sleeves rolled up, a smudge of flour on her left shoulder, and an apron tied loosely around her waist. She looked warm, familiar. I tried making scones this time, she said. It may be more rock then. Pastry, but I figured I'd attempt something fancier. I laughed and held up a small mason jar of homemade raspberry jam I'd picked up from the farmer's market earlier that morning. Backup plan, I joked. She took it, read the label, and grinned. Well then, I guess we're covered. Inside, her house smelled like cinnamon, butter, and something faintly floral. The laptop I'd helped repair sat on the coffee table. In the living room, screen open to the document she'd been working on. She'd highlighted a few paragraphs. I could tell by the bolded font and marginal notes that she'd been writing since early that morning. Maybe earlier, there was a quiet urgency to her words lately. Like she'd opened a door inside herself, and now couldn't close it again. It's like something long buried had found air, and now needed to breathe. We sat down without much ceremony, our plates balanced in our laps, and began reading through the newest chapter together. She'd written about her father this time. Not in a sentimental way, but with a kind of blunt honesty that made my throat tighten. He was a quiet man, she wrote. The kind who believed emotions were better left on the shelf beside old trophies and broken radios. She detailed the moments when she'd wanted to scream, wanted to cry, but swallowed it all because the house she grew up in had invisible rules like don't talk about that and just keep going. I looked over at her when we got to the last paragraph. Her eyes weren't on the screen. They were on me, waiting. Not for approval, I realized, but for understanding, for proof that she wasn't alone in the remembering. It's heavy, I said softly, but it's real. And that matters more than making it sound pretty. She nodded, her fingers tightening slightly around her mug. I was afraid to write that part, she said. Even now, it feels like I'm betraying someone by telling the truth. That's how you know it's worth telling, I replied. After we finished reviewing the draft, we shifted again slowly, as we always did, to something more personal. She asked if I'd ever had moments like that with my own parents. I told her about my mom's silence when I dropped out of college the first time, and my dad's way of patting me on the back instead of saying the words I needed to hear. We talked about how families don't always know how to love you the way you need, even if they think they're trying, and how sometimes strangers turn out to be better mirrors for your pain than the people who raised you. At some point, she leaned back against the couch, stretching her legs out and letting the sunlight fall across her face. Her hair glinted silver where it caught the light, but there was something almost youthful about the way she looked in that moment, relaxed, unguarded, like she'd shed a skin. "You ever feel like you missed out on the version of yourself you were supposed to be?" she asked. The question hit harder than I expected. I stared at the jam jar on the table, the spoon resting in the half-empty bowl between us. "Yeah," I said finally, "all the time." We sat in the quiet that followed, not needing to fill it. It felt like the kind of silence you share with someone when both of you know exactly what the other is thinking, and there's comfort in not needing to say it aloud. Eventually, she stood and stretched. "Want to help me in the garden?" she asked. "I've got some roses trying to escape their beds, and I could use a second pair of hands." I followed her out back, and for the next hour we worked in the dirt, trimming, watering, pulling weeds. It was peaceful, meditative, the kind of labor that felt purposeful without pressure. She talked about her mother's garden, about how she used to watch her plant bulbs in silence every spring, as if it were a ritual only she could understand. I told her about the tiny cactus I kept on my windowsill and how proud I was that I hadn't killed it yet. She laughed, and the sound of it made something inside me settle at one point. I glanced over and caught her just watching me, her expression soft, unreadable. When I raised an eyebrow in silent question, she just smiled and said, "I don't think I've ever felt so seen by someone who didn't expect anything from me." I didn't have a response to that, not one that would have done it justice. So instead, I reached down, gently pressed a stake into the soil beside a leaning rose stem, and tied it upright with a loose piece of twine. She watched the movement, then quietly returned to her work. By late afternoon, we'd finished most of the yard. We stood side by side looking at our handiwork. The garden looked neater, more intentional. But there was still wildness at the edges, flowers that refused to be tamed, ivy that had crept past its borders. She didn't seem to mind. "Sometimes the wild parts are the most honest," she said. I walked home that day with dirt under my fingernails and the scent of lavender clinging to my clothes. But more than that, I walked away with the growing sense that whatever this was, this connection, this shared space between us, it was quietly becoming one of the most real things in my life. And even though I couldn't name it yet, I knew I would come back. Again and again, the week drifted by with a kind of stillness that felt unusual in my routine. I had other clients, of course, plenty of them. Computers that needed fixing, wireless routers acting up, printers that refused to cooperate, the usual litany of tech frustrations. But no matter how many houses I entered or systems I tweaked, my mind always found its way back to her, to the soft expression on her face when the sunlight hit just right, to the way she'd said she felt seen. I didn't know how to name what was building between us, but it wasn't simple admiration. It wasn't even infatuation. It was slower, quieter, like two puzzle pieces realizing they might just fit after all these years being boxed up separately. When Saturday came around, I found myself leaving the house early, though I wasn't due at hers until 10. I stopped for coffee and thought about bringing her one, but then remembered she liked to brew her own. Strong, black, no sugar. The way she drank it was how she carried herself, bold, straightforward, with no need to sweeten the truth. I arrived at her place a few minutes early and found her already outside sweeping the porch. She looked up, squinting into the morning light, and smiled like she'd been expecting me. Like this weekly rhythm had become a comfort for her too. I didn't have any technical crises this week, she said, holding open the door as I stepped in. But I figured you'd still show up. I shrugged with a grin. Well, someone's got to keep your computer from imploding under the weight of all those emotional confessions. She laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that didn't just stay in her throat, echoed a little, filled the room like she'd forgotten how good it felt. There were new pages printed and stacked on the coffee table again. She was writing fast, faster than before, as if the dam had finally broken, and the words were pouring out like floodwater. This chapter was about love. Not romantic love exactly, but the early confusion of it. A boy in high school who kissed her in the art room and then never spoke to her again. A college friend who called her beautiful when he was drunk and never mentioned it in the daylight. She wrote about those first aches that aren't loud but stay lodged somewhere behind the ribs. The kind that never bleed, but always bruise. I read quietly while she watched, sipping her coffee with both hands like it grounded her. When I looked up, she didn't speak right away, just tilted her head like she was trying to read me the way I was reading her pages. "I think you're brave," I said, "for letting all this out." She smiled but shook her head. "I think I'm just tired of hiding." We moved on from the manuscript after a while. She handed me her phone, which was having issues syncing with her laptop. Nothing complicated, just a matter of updating some settings and transferring a few old photos. But when I pulled up the gallery, I noticed a folder labeled Untitled. Out of habit more than curiosity, I asked if she wanted me to back it up too. Her face went still, not cold, but paused, like something inside her had frozen. She said, quietly. I clicked it open and found photographs, not selfies or vacation shots, but portraits. Self-portraits, to be exact. Some taken in front of her bathroom mirror, others in soft window light. Not posed or curated, just honest. Some with no makeup, some with her hair wild and undone. In one, she looked directly into the lens with a defiance that felt almost confrontational. In another, her eyes were redrimmed like she'd been crying. But her mouth was set firm like she didn't regret whatever made her feel that way. It was like looking through a window into the parts of her she never showed the world. "You're the only person who's ever seen those," she said. "I don't know why I took them. Sometimes I wanted to see myself as I was, not as how people expected me to be. But I never had the courage to show them." I looked at her and realized how rare this kind of vulnerability was. Not the dramatic, theatrical kind, but the quiet kind. The kind that takes real strength to even share. "They're beautiful," I said honestly. "Not because they're polished, because they're real." She didn't look away this time. "Do you ever feel like you're playing a part?" she asked. "Like everyone expects you to be someone you never agreed to become?" "All the time," I admitted. "Sometimes I think I became a handyman just so no one would expect more from me. It's easier to fix things outside myself than to deal with the things inside." We sat with that truth for a while, both of us stripped down in our own silent ways. I backed up her photos, encrypted them into a secure folder, and set her phone and laptop to sync automatically. It wasn't a big job, but it felt important, like I was safeguarding more than just data. Like I was protecting pieces of her. Afterwards, she invited me out back again. But this time, instead of gardening, she had a canvas set up. It was old, slightly dusted at the corners, and propped against an easel that hadn't been used in years. "I used to paint," she said. Stopped around the same time I stopped letting myself feel things too deeply, I thought. Maybe it's time to try again. I stood beside her as she dipped the brush in paint, her hand tentative at first, but stroke by stroke she relaxed. I didn't say much, just watched, occasionally handing her a rag or a new tube of color. Watching her paint was like watching someone reclaim something stolen. Not a talent, but a permission. It's permission to exist in color again. Permission to make a mess and not apologize for it. At one point, she looked at me with a faint smile. "You know, if someone had told me a year ago that I'd feel the safest around a man I barely knew, I would have laughed in their face. And now?" I asked. She looked at the half-finished painting, the soft blur of blue sky starting to take shape. "Now I think maybe I'm finally starting to believe I deserve to be seen." I didn't answer her with words. I just stayed present. Steady. The same way she had stayed with her own truth long enough to let it breathe. It was becoming clear that neither of us had planned for this, whatever it was. But that didn't make it any less real. If anything, it made it more so. And in that quiet backyard with the scent of acrylic paint in the air, and her brush gently moving across the canvas, I realized that something between us had shifted again. Subtly, but undeniably, we weren't just two people sharing time. Anymore, we were beginning to share selves. The following Tuesday, it rained. Not the kind of storm that screams down on rooftops and rattles windows, but a steady drizzle that painted the world in grayscale and slowed everything down. I wasn't supposed to see her until Friday, but I found myself driving in her direction. Anyway, no excuse lined up, no urgent tech call. just the pull of something I hadn't let myself name yet. Her house looked different in the rain, softer, quieter, like it too had secrets it only shared in certain light. I sat in my truck for a few minutes, unsure if I should text her first or just knock, but before I could do either, the porch light flicked on. She must have seen me pull in. The door opened a moment later, and there she was, wrapped in a thick cardigan, with a cup of tea in one hand and a knowing smile on her face. "I thought that might be you," she said. "Come in. I was just thinking of you." The warmth inside hit me like a blanket fresh from the dryer. Her place always smelled like cinnamon and wood polish, but there was something extra that day, maybe vanilla from a candle or the soft echo of jazz humming low from the radio. She handed me a towel, and I dried off as she poured me a cup of whatever tea she was drinking. Chamomile, I think. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the patter of rain and the lazy trumpet playing from the kitchen speaker. Less like a break in the day, and more like stepping into a different dimension, where time paused and everything outside the walls of that small house stopped mattering. "I started another painting," she said eventually, nodding toward the back room. "It's messy, but it felt good." I told her I'd love to see it, but she shook her head gently. "Not yet. It's not ready. Or maybe I'm not." Didn't press. She'd shown me her writing, her photographs, the edges of herself she'd spent years tucking away. If she wanted to keep this one thing private for now, I would respect that. Instead, we talked. Not about tech or settings or syncing devices, just about life. She told me about her childhood dog, a scrappy mutt named Toby, who used to wait by the school gate every afternoon. She described how her mother braided her hair every Sunday morning before church, even after she was old enough to do it herself. She said it made her feel cared for, even when the rest of the week felt like she was invisible. I shared about my old neighborhood, the alleyway where I'd learned to fix bikes, the teacher who told me I had working man's hands and meant it as a compliment. These weren't monumental stories, but they felt like stitching small threads tying the fabric between us tighter. At some point, we moved to the floor. She had a thick rug in the living room, and we sat cross-legged with mugs in hand, flipping through an old photo album she hadn't looked at in years. Her fingers hesitated over some pages, tracing the faces of people long gone or long silent. She showed me a picture of herself at 20 hair longer, eyes wider, wearing a dress she'd sewn herself for a college dance. I remember feeling beautiful that night, she said. Not because anyone told me, it's just because I believed it, even if only for an hour. That hit me harder than I expected. I wondered how many women go through life collecting hours like that, moments when they feel beautiful, valued, soon only to tuck them away like treasures no one else will ever know existed. The sky outside had turned a deep charcoal gray by the time she got up to light a few candles. The electricity blinked once, twice, then held steady. "Power might go," she said with a shrug. "Always does during long rains." I offered to check her backup batteries, and she laughed. "Of course you did. You're the only man I know who brings comfort and surge protection." We both laughed at that. It was becoming a thing, her little jokes, my dry comebacks. The ease that stretched between us like a shared sweater. She asked if I wanted to stay for dinner. I said yes without hesitation. We made pasta together well. She cooked, and I chopped, and occasionally stirred when she pointed. She moved through the kitchen like it was her stage, humming under her breath, teasing me for cutting the garlic too thick. I didn't mind. I liked watching her, like this free, light, playful. Like maybe the woman she used to be was waking up again. Or maybe she was just letting me see more of her. We ate by candlelight, not because the power went out, but because she wanted to. She said it made things feel intentional. Slower, I agreed. The rain continued, a constant hush that wrapped around the house like a lullaby. After we ate, she put on a record, something old and jazzy, and we sat back on the floor, sipping wine this time. Her head rested on the back of the couch, eyes half closed, humming along to the melody. I watched her in the low light, the flicker of the candles playing across her face, and felt something settle in my chest. Not anxiety, not nerves, just calm. Like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, Then she looked at me, really looked, and said, almost in a whisper, "Do you ever feel like maybe, just maybe, you found someone who sees you without needing to fix you?" I didn't answer right away. I wasn't sure how, but I reached over, gently took her hand, and held it. No words, no pressure. Just skin to skin, warmth to warmth. Her fingers curled around mine, slow and steady. We stayed like that for a long time, listening to music, listening to rain, listening to the quiet between us that no longer felt empty, but full of everything unspoken. I didn't kiss her, not yet. It wasn't the moment for that. This was something deeper, a different kind of intimacy. The kind that says, "I'm not going anywhere." And in that moment, I think she believed me, and maybe for the first time in years. She believed in herself, too. The days that followed didn't carry any grand declarations or dramatic shifts, but something had definitely changed between us. I could feel it in the way she opened the door a little quicker when I arrived, or how her eyes lingered on me a little longer as I spoke. It was subtle, the way seasons change without a single moment of transformation, but unmistakable once you stood still long enough to notice. I was back at her place, not for a job this time, but because she asked if I could help her reorganize. Her study. Nothing technical, she'd said with a laugh. Just a little heavy lifting. And I don't trust the movers not to scuff the floors I just had polished. It was clearly an excuse, but one I was grateful for. When I got there, she was barefoot, hair tied loosely back, wearing an old college sweatshirt and leggings. She looked effortlessly beautiful, the kind of beauty that didn't demand attention, but commanded it anyway. The study was cluttered, but charming books stacked on every surface, art leaning against walls, old notebooks with weathered corners, and a tiny window that let in a perfect shaft of late afternoon sun. She had ideas for where she wanted everything, but admitted she hadn't committed to any layout yet. "I just know it needs to feel different," she said, almost more to herself than to me. "This room held a version of me I don't want to carry forward, so we moved furniture." We laughed as we nearly tipped over a bookshelf trying to wedge it into a corner. She paused often, running her fingers over the spines of books or flipping through old sketch pads, deciding what to keep and what to box up. There was a reverence in the way she handled her memories, even the ones she admitted she wanted to let go of. We talked while we worked, and the conversation drifted deeper again, not in a heavy way, but naturally, like we were two hikers finding the same rhythm along a quiet trail. She asked me if I ever felt stuck, like my life was waiting for me to catch up to it. I told her the truth, that sometimes I wondered if I'd missed a turn somewhere, chosen work that was safe instead of something that made my soul sit up straighter. She nodded, like she understood exactly what that felt like. There was a moment as I lifted a small chest to the far side of the room, when she stood watching me with a kind of softness I hadn't seen before. I thought she might say something, maybe offer another one of those vulnerable truths she'd begun to trust me with. But instead, she walked over, gently tugged the edge of her sleeve down over her hand, and began wiping dust off the top of an old desk. I knew then that whatever was growing between us needed space, not pressured to breathe. To say the thing we both were thinking, and maybe I wasn't either. By late evening, the study was transformed. The light shifted through the window at a different angle now, hitting the far wall where she'd hung one of her paintings, the first one she ever showed me, the one with the blues and deep maroons that reminded me of dusk over the ocean. She made coffee while I packed up the last of the empty boxes, and we sat cross-legged on the floor again, our new ritual. She leaned back against the wall, a little tired, a little content, and I could see the ease settling into her. "You know," she said after a long silence, "I used to be afraid of silence. It always made me feel like I should be doing something, saying something, proving something." She took a sip from her mug. "But with you, the quiet feels different. Not like absence, more like presence." I wasn't sure how to respond. Her words felt like a gift I didn't want to unwrap too quickly. So instead, I reached over and lightly brushed her hand with mine, letting it rest there for just a second before pulling back. It wasn't bold, it wasn't romantic, it was respectful, but it was also charged with everything we weren't saying out loud yet. She smiled at me then, this warm, wide, deeply real smile that made my chest feel like it couldn't contain my ribs. And when she said thank you, just those two words, I knew she wasn't talking about the furniture or the organizing. She was thanking me for staying, for listening, for seeing her. The rain had stopped outside, and the world felt still. I helped her clean up, put tools away, stacked the boxes in her garage. As I was about to leave, she followed me to the door and paused before opening it. You know, she said softly, I used to dread asking for help. It always made me feel like I was burdening someone. But with you, it feels like you want to be here. I told her that I did, and I meant it. I hadn't felt drawn to someone this way in a long time, drawn not by drama or desire, but by the quiet recognition that they brought out something truer in me. We stood there for a beat, neither of us quite ready to break the moment. And then she surprised me, not with a kiss, not with a touch, but by reaching up and tucking a small slip of paper into my shirt pocket. Don't read it until you get home, she said with a wink. I promised I wouldn't, but the second I was in my truck, I unfolded. It wasn't a love note or a poem. It's just a quote handwritten in her looping script. Maybe we're all just waiting for someone to see the things we've stopped showing. Underneath, in smaller print, she'd added, Thank you for seeing me. I sat there in my truck for a long time, the note resting in my palm, the house glowing softly in my rearview mirror. And I realized this wasn't just a chapter in her life that I'd stumbled into. This was something new for both of us. Something honest, unrushed. A connection built not on timing or perfection, but on the quiet bravery of showing up exactly as we were. I didn't sleep much that night. The words she had written on that slip of paper looped in my mind over and over again, like a melody you don't want to forget. Thank you for seeing me. It was simple, understated, but carried a gravity that made my chest ache in the best way. I had never been thanked like that before, not for my skills, not for a job well done, but for simply witnessing someone's truth and not looking away. The next morning, I caught myself smiling over coffee without realizing it. I didn't try to chase the feeling away. I let it sit, warm and strange and a little terrifying. That day, I didn't hear from her, but I didn't expect to. I knew instinctively that after a moment like that, we both needed a little room to let it settle. But my thoughts drifted back to her house constantly, to the way the afternoon light touched her cheek, how she moved through that study like she was finally reclaiming something that once felt lost. By the following evening, I found myself driving by her street without a reason and chuckling at myself for being that obvious. I turned the truck around, telling myself I'd text her the next day. I didn't have to wait long, though. The following morning, my phone lit up with a message from her. Just one sentence. Any chance I can steal a bit more of your time this week? That was all it took. She wanted help rearranging some things in the living room. Nothing pressing, she said. Just a little shift in energy. When I showed up, she had jazz playing in the background, barefoot again, sipping tea. The curtains were open, and the whole room smelled faintly of oranges and cedar. There was something more relaxed about her that day, as if the vulnerability she'd shared before had unknotted something in her shoulders. We moved furniture, debated rug angles, tried 2 different lamp setups, and in between all of that, we kept talking. But the conversation wasn't small. She told me about the time she almost moved to Florence on a whim in her early 30s, but changed her mind last minute because of a job offer that, in hindsight, wasn't worth it. She spoke of regret like a companion she'd learned to coexist. With not a wound, she tried to hide. I listened the way she once listened to me fully, without rushing to respond. And when she paused, I could feel her weighing whether to say more. She did. She sat on the edge of the couch and told me about a man she'd once been engaged to. Someone who checked all the boxes but never truly made her feel safe. He liked the idea of me, she said quietly, but not the actual me. I let that go on too long. Her voice didn't shake, but there was a tightness in her jaw, like she had learned to hold things in for too long out of politeness. I knelt beside the coffee table, rearranging a stack of books, giving her space, but letting her know I was there. Sometimes she added, I think I stayed in that relationship because I didn't believe I deserved more. Strange. How silence can trick you into thinking it's peace. Those words hit me deep. I hadn't lived her life, but I understood what it meant to settle, to shrink to fit into someone else's world because you were too scared of being alone by. The time we finished with the living room, it looked like an entirely different space. It wasn't just the furniture, it was the feeling. It's lighter, freer, like it finally reflected the woman she was becoming, not the version she'd been trying to live up to. She offered to cook dinner, something quick, she said, though I would have stayed even if all she had were crackers. In the kitchen, we moved like a team, chopping, stirring, laughing. At one point, we bumped into each other near the fridge, and neither of us stepped back right away. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't full of tension. It was quiet and magnetic, like standing near a fireplace and suddenly realizing how warm you are. She looked up at me, eyes searching mine, and I knew the question she didn't say out loud. But she didn't move, and neither did I. We finished making dinner, shared it at her little table by the window, and talked until the stars started showing through the glass. When I finally stood to leave, she walked me to the door again. She reached for the handle but didn't open it. Instead, she turned toward me and asked, Do you ever feel like life is giving you a second chance, but it's quiet about it, like it's waiting to see if you'll notice? I told her yes. Right now. This moment. This feeling. All of it felt like something whispering, Here's your chance. Don't look away. She stepped back just a little and smiled, but there was something different in her smile this time. Not guarded, not unsure, but wide open. And for the first time, I let myself imagine what it might be like to kiss her. I didn't act on it, not yet. But I didn't hide from the thought either. I said goodnight, and as I stepped into the evening air, I felt a shift not in the world, but in me. Something about the way she saw me, how she let herself be seen by me, made everything else feel muted in comparison. Driving home, I rolled the windows down. The night air was cool and smelled faintly of jasmine and rain. I thought of her in that candlelit room, probably washing dishes or changing into pajamas, completely unaware of how thoroughly she had begun to take up space in my world. And as I turned onto the highway, I realized I wasn't afraid anymore. Not of what this might become or of what it might mean. The first time in a long time, I wasn't chasing a version of myself I thought I had to be. I was just me. And somehow that felt like enough. The days that followed carried an undercurrent of quiet expectation, like the low hum of anticipation before the first notes of a favorite song. I didn't see her for a few days, but we exchanged short messages. Warm, casual, never too much, but always enough to keep the air between us alive. Sometimes it was a photo of her morning tea beside a book, sometimes a simple thinking of our conversation, or even just a hope today's not too hard. I didn't press, and neither did she. And that in itself felt like the most natural rhythm I'd experienced with anyone in years. It was a strange feeling to be drawn to. Someone not through urgency or fire, but through quiet, deliberate honesty. It didn't roar, it glowed. And that glow was more consuming than anything I had ever burned for. One afternoon, got a call from her, not a message, but her voice, slightly breathless and unusually giddy. I found an old box in the attic, she said, laughing. Photos? Letters, college nonsense. It's ridiculous. I'm knee-deep in it. Want to see how awkward I used to be? I said yes without thinking. 10 minutes later, I was parking in front of her house again, my heart thudding with that odd combination of excitement and ease that only she seemed to stir in me. She met me at the door in jeans and a paint-stained shirt, her hair up in a loose bun, a smudge of dust on her cheek. She looked radiant, real, like someone who had spent the day in her memories, but wasn't afraid of them anymore. She led me into the den, where a few old cardboard boxes sat open like little treasure chests of nostalgia. Polaroids spilled out beside curled notebook pages and faded postcards. She sat cross-legged on the floor and handed me a stack. I warn you, she said, smiling mischievously. I was all bangs and oversized sweaters for most of the 90s. We flipped through the photos together, laughing at high school yearbook shots and early college fashion crimes. Ever pictures of her as a teenager, full of attitude and curiosity. And then others more solemn ones, where I saw glimpses of the woman I now knew. There was one where she was standing beside a computer, her arms crossed, grinning in that stubborn, defiant way she still sometimes did. This was when I thought I'd work in tech, she said. I dropped it after one semester. I loved the people more than the machines. I told her that probably explained why I kept coming back to fix hers, as we sifted through old letters and notes. She paused on a folded sheet tucked into the bottom of a box. She unfolded it slowly, her eyes scanning the page like it held something fragile. This was from my mom, she said softly. The last birthday card she gave me before she passed. Her voice didn't break, but I saw her inhale deeply. Steadying herself, she handed it to me, and I read the elegant, looping handwriting. It was simple, just a few lines. You are more than what the world tells you to be. Don't forget to let people see that. I handed it back to her with a quiet nod. I didn't let anyone see it for a long time, she said. And now here I am, showing it to the guy who came to fix my Wi-Fi. The moment lingered, not heavy but meaningful. The kind of silence that doesn't beg to be filled. Later, she offered me a drink, nothing fancy, just iced tea with lemonade. We moved on to the porch. The sun was beginning to dip low, casting long shadows across the lawn. The air smelled of warm pine and cut grass, and I could hear the distant hum of sprinklers from the neighbor's yard. She leaned back in her chair and looked at me for a long time, her gaze unguarded. You know, she said, for years I thought I had to be the strongest person in every room. I built entire parts of my personality around being unshakable. She paused, tracing her finger along the rim of her glass. But lately, I've realized that strength sometimes looks like letting someone sit beside you while you feel like falling apart. I didn't respond right away. I didn't need to. She knew I understood. She'd seen me when I admitted the cracks in my own life, and I'd seen hers. It's not as flaws, but as the places light entered. We stayed out there for over an hour talking about nothing and everything. About music we used. To love the first times we got our hearts broken, the books that changed us. I learned that she once wrote a poem that won a state contest in high school but never showed anyone the full version because she felt like it was too personal. She told me about how she once ran through the rain barefoot at midnight just to remind herself that she still felt alive. I told her about the treehouse I built with my uncle when I was 10, and how I used to bring my sketchbooks up there and pretend I was designing secret buildings for hidden worlds. Eventually, the evening gave way to twilight, and the porch light flickered on. She looked at me and said, I feel like you're the only one who sees me and doesn't try to fix me. That struck me harder than I expected, coming from someone who had spent her whole life believing she had to present a curated version of herself to the world. Those words were a revelation. And to me, a man who had always tried to measure his worth in what he could do, not just who he was, that meant everything. She reached over and gently placed her hand over mine, not possessive, not hesitant, just certain. Her thumb moved slowly over the back of my hand, and for a moment, it felt like the world slowed down. We didn't kiss. Not yet. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was deeper. It was the kind of moment that told you something was unfolding, and rushing it would only diminish it. Eventually, I stood to leave. She walked me to the door as always, and this time when she said goodnight, her voice was softer than usual, like she was saying more than just the word. I stepped out into the night feeling something shift inside me again. It wasn't dramatic or cinematic. It was quiet and certain. The kind of certainty that wraps itself around your heart and says, this matters. Pay attention. As I drove home under a velvet sky full of stars, I realized I had stopped thinking about what this was supposed to be. I didn't need to define it. I just knew it was real, and I knew I wanted more of it. Not because it completed me, or saved me, or filled some void, but because in her presence, I found a version of myself I genuinely liked, and I got the sense she felt the same. That, to me, was the beginning of something I'd never had before. Not just a connection, but a mutual unfolding. Two people slowly, honestly, carefully making room for each other. I woke up the next morning with her on my mind, but not in the way infatuation usually creeps into your thoughts. It wasn't obsession or longing or even romance in the traditional sense. It was more like a calm sense of knowing. Like when you wake up and remember that something good is waiting for you later in the day. Something honest. That day, I had a few appointments lined up, basic maintenance calls, home office upgrade, and a graphics card install. But every idle moment in between, I thought of her. I thought about that box of memories, the soft way she smiled when she let me read her mother's words, and the way her fingers had curled around mine so naturally on the porch. It wasn't just that she had let me in. It was that she hadn't tried to control the way I saw her. No filtering, no performance. Just her. I hadn't known how much I needed that until she offered it so freely. It was the following Friday, when she invited me over again. This time she said she had a surprise. Her text was short. Come hungry, and wear something you can dance in. Laughed when I read it, but part of me knew she wasn't joking. She had that side to her, the playful current beneath the thoughtful exterior, the part of her that still believed in joy for joy's sake. I showed up at her place just before 6, wearing my most flexible jeans and a decent shirt, not quite formal, not quite lazy. She answered the door wearing a flowing skirt and a tank top, her hair down, eyes bright. The living room was cleared of furniture, a Bluetooth speaker sitting in the center of the floor. The smell of pasta drifted from the kitchen. She handed me a glass of wine and said, "Dinner in 20? Dancing after?" Over spaghetti and roasted vegetables, we talked like we always did, easy. Flowing conversation where every pause had its place. She told me about a French film she'd watched the night before, and I told her about an older couple I'd met at a repair job who kept arguing over which one of them broke their printer. The meal was good, but it was the company that filled me up. After we cleared the dishes, she dimmed the lights and hit play on her speaker. Old soul classics began to echo through the room. Marvin Gaye, Al Green, Etta James. Without asking, she took my hand and led me to the open space. I laughed awkwardly at first, but she didn't let me off the hook. She moved slowly, not expecting me to lead, not needing me to perform, just moving with the music, inviting me to do the same. It had been years since I danced with someone without the fog of alcohol or the pressure of impressing anyone. Years since I'd felt that kind of freedom to just be in my body in the moment, without analyzing what came next. She twirled once, then twice, laughing as she nearly lost her balance. I caught her by the waist, and our eyes met in the soft glow of a table lamp. The music slowed, and so did we. I rested my hand at the small of her back, and she leaned into me slightly, her head finding the hollow of my shoulder like it had been there before. We swayed to the rhythm, not speaking, letting the silence fill the space between lyrics. It wasn't romantic in the storybook, since it was real. Two people, both scarred in different ways, choosing presence over pretense. When the song ended, she looked up at me with something deeper than affection in her eyes. I couldn't place it then, but I would later. It was trust. Not just in me, but in herself. She was beginning to trust that she could feel this way again without losing who she was. And I, for the first time in a long time, wasn't running from the stillness that came with that trust. We sat down on the floor after that, backs against the wall, catching our breath. The speaker kept playing softly, but neither of us moved to turn it off. She glanced at me and said, "I used to be afraid of this." I asked. "Afraid of what?" She replied, "Of being seen, and not being able to live up to whatever people thought they saw in me. But now, I think I'd rather risk that than keep hiding." I understood that fear well. I'd lived in it, always afraid that the more someone knew me, the less they'd want to stay. But sitting next to her on that hardwood floor, knees brushing, hands occasionally finding each other's, I felt none of that panic, only peace. Eventually, I told her that. Not in poetic language, not with grand declarations. Just simply, I feel calm with you. I don't have to pretend. She leaned her head on my shoulder again, and in that moment, everything unsaid between us seemed perfectly understood. That night, when I left, There was no kiss again. Not yet. She walked me to the door as always, but this time, when she said, "Goodbye," her voice held a certainty that was unmistakable. I didn't need to ask what it meant. Driving home, I rolled down the windows again, the night air brushing against my face like a secret. The stars above seemed brighter, or maybe it was just me seeing more clearly. I thought about how connection doesn't always show up in fireworks or grand gestures. Sometimes it's in the quiet invitation to dance in a cleared-out living room. Sometimes it's in the act of showing someone your worst yearbook photo and waiting to see if they still smile. Sometimes it's just a hand on your knee in silence that doesn't ask to be filled. And in all those little things I realized love was beginning to take root. Not loudly, not urgently, but deeply. I didn't know what came next, and for once, that didn't scare me. What mattered was that it wasn't just me anymore. It was us. Not defined, not labeled, not hurried. Just something real, unfolding in its own time. And I knew, without needing her to say it, that she felt the same. The next few days passed like they often do when something unexpected. But beautiful starts taking up space in your heart, you try to go on like normal. But everything feels slightly tilted in a good way. Work still came. Emails still piled up, errands still needed to be run, but underneath it all, I had this persistent hum of anticipation, the kind you can't quiet even if you wanted to. She'd texted me once since our impromptu dance night. Just a photo of a book cover with the caption, "Reminds me of you." I stared at that message for longer than I cared to admit. I didn't even know what the book was about, but that didn't matter. It meant she was thinking of me. In the background, not casually, she was holding me in the same quiet but deliberate way I was holding her. By Thursday, I found myself wanting an excuse to see her again. I didn't want to make it too obvious, but I also didn't want to hide the truth of it. There was something between us now that neither of us had named, but both of us had definitely felt, so I texted her something simple. "Hey, I just finished up early today. If you need anything techie done, now's the time." It wasn't subtle, but it wasn't desperate either. Her reply came a few minutes later. "Actually, I do. Come by?" There wasn't even a period at the end. Just those 3 words like an open door. When I got there, the lights in her house were softer than usual, almost like she'd dimmed them on purpose. There was no music playing this time, no wine waiting on the table. She met me at the door, wearing a loose sweater and jeans, barefoot. She looked comfortable, not just in clothes, but in herself. Like someone who wasn't preparing to host or impress, but simply to share space. She stepped aside, let me in, and led me toward the hallway without explanation. I followed, curious but calm, until we reached a room I hadn't seen before. It was smaller, more intimate. A desk with scattered notebooks, an old painting of a field at dusk on the wall, and in the corner an antique upright piano. She gestured toward it and said, "This is what's been broken, not the computer." This, I stood there, not sure what she wanted me to do. I wasn't a piano technician, and she knew that. But I didn't say anything. Looked over, lifted the lid, and pressed a few keys. Most were out of tune. One stuck completely. She turned to me, eyes steady but vulnerable, and said, "My dad gave me this when I was 17. I used to play every day. But after he passed, I stopped." A long time I couldn't even look at it without crying. I thought, maybe if you were here, I could try again. It was the most personal kind of invitation. She wasn't asking me to fix the piano. She was asking me to bear witness to her, trying to fix something in herself. I didn't say anything. I just nodded and pulled a nearby chair close, sitting beside her as she sat down in front of the instrument. Her fingers hovered above the keys like she was asking their permission. Then, slowly, she began to play. The melody was familiar, but hesitant. Like it had been waiting inside her all these years, and now struggled to find its way out. A few wrong notes, a few faltered pauses, but her expression remained open, like she wasn't afraid of being bad. She just wanted to remember what it felt like. I watched her, not just her hands, but her face, her posture, the way she breathed differently. Once the rhythm started returning to her, it was like watching someone remember who they were before the world started convincing them to be someone else. When she finished, she didn't look at me. She looked at the keys, running her fingers gently over them, like she was comforting an old friend. Then, in a voice so quiet I almost missed it, she said, "Thank you for not looking away." Those words hit harder than I expected because that's what so many people do, right? When someone gets vulnerable, when the cracks show, when the scars start to surface, they look away. They make it awkward, or worse, they try to fix it instead of just being there for it. But I didn't look away. The truth is, I hadn't even thought about it. Being there for her didn't feel like a choice. It felt like the most natural thing in the world. She closed the piano lid gently, stood up, and came over to sit beside me. We didn't speak for a long time, just sat there, side by side, letting the silence be something full instead of something empty. Eventually, she reached over and took my hand, holding it loosely, like someone testing the weight of a truth they were just beginning to accept. I turned my palm upward, laced my fingers with hers, and squeezed once. Not a promise, not a declaration, it's just a response. She leaned her head on my shoulder, and for the next half hour we sat like that. No music, no distractions. Just the soft sound of breath and a connection that had been quietly deepening with every shared look, every confession, every small act of presence. Before I left that night, she walked me to the door again. But this time, she didn't just stand in the frame. She stepped outside into the night with me and said, "Next time, bring something you love too. Something you haven't touched in years." I didn't answer right away. I just looked at her, this woman who had unknowingly cracked open something buried inside me, nodded, driving home. I thought about her words, something I hadn't touched in years. There were a few things that came to mind: my old sketchbook, a dusty telescope from my high school astronomy phase, a half-written song saved on a USB drive somewhere. But more than those items, I realized the thing I hadn't touched in years was this, the part of me that still believed people could see the mess and not only stay, but also love me more for it. And with her, that part was starting to stir again. The next time I saw her, the air between us felt change, not heavier, but richer. Like we'd added a layer to our connection that couldn't be undone. She'd invited me over on a rainy Saturday afternoon. It's the kind of rain that doesn't rage or thunder, just drifts down in steady patterns like it has all the time in the world. I parked in front of her house and sat in my car for a moment, watching the droplets slide down the windshield, wondering what I was about to walk into. Last time, she had shown me something sacred. I hadn't known how deeply that would linger with me until I found myself replaying it in my head at random. Hours of the day, her voice, her trembling fingers on the piano, the quiet way she leaned against me. It wasn't romance in the traditional sense. It was something older than that, something rooted and real. I knocked only once before she opened the door, like she'd been waiting just behind it. She wore a green cardigan that matched the soft tone of the afternoon, her hair loose, her smile almost shy. She stepped aside and let me in, and I noticed right away that something had shifted in her house too. The living room was lit by low lamps and the soft flicker of a candle on the coffee table. The clutter that used to mark the corners, books, extra cords, stacked dishes, was all tidied away. Not in a clinical way, but in a deliberate one. She'd made space. She motioned for me to sit while she disappeared into the kitchen. I heard her humming faintly an old tune I couldn't place. When she returned, she brought 2 mugs of something warm and fragrant. Not coffee, not tea. I asked her what it was, and she said it was a recipe her grandmother used to make steamed milk with cinnamon, vanilla, and a bit of honey. For comfort, she handed me the mug, and we sat quietly, sipping, listening to the rain. Eventually, she turned to me and said, "Did you bring it?" At first, I didn't know what she meant. Then, I remembered her last words to me. Bring something I hadn't touched in years. I reached into my bag and pulled out a black sketch pad with a broken spine. Its corners bent, the elastic band stretched thin with time. She looked at it like it was a rare artifact. I hadn't opened it yet. I hadn't drawn in over a decade. Not since before my dad died. Not since art stopped feeling like joy and started feeling like grief. I handed it to her and said, "You can look. Just be kind." She didn't answer with words. She simply took it gently, placed her mug on the table, and opened the cover. The pages were filled with moments of my life frozen in pencil-quiet street corners. Old faces from memory, the creases in my mother's hands, the back of someone's neck I used to love. Her fingers moved carefully over each page, pausing now and then with a kind of reverence. When she looked up, her eyes were glossy. She didn't cry, not exactly, but her voice was thick when she said, "These are beautiful. These are parts of you I wouldn't have seen if you hadn't trusted me." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. She handed the book back, but then did something unexpected. She stood, walked to the small cabinet near her window, and pulled out her own journal. A thick, red leather-bound book with weathered pages. She brought it to me and placed it on my lap, saying, "Your turn." I looked up at her, and she smiled a little. "I write. Mostly nonsense, thoughts, memories. I've never let anyone read it." I felt the weight of it. Not just physically, but emotionally. She was offering something real, and filtered pieces of herself in written form. I opened to a random page and began to read. Her handwriting was delicate but expressive. The page held a reflection about turning 40 and realizing she'd spent most of her life performing for others. Another page, a few entries later, talked about the way loneliness doesn't always feel like emptiness. Sometimes it feels like constant noise. Like your mind won't stop talking to fill the silence. I read slowly, not rushing, taking in the rhythm of her thoughts. It felt intimate, almost too intimate. But she watched me without fear. Without hesitation, we spent the next hour sharing parts of ourselves that we'd kept hidden from the world. At one point, she pulled out an old Polaroid of herself at 19 standing in front of a bookstore with a friend. Laughing, her arms raised, like she was about to take off into the sky. I couldn't stop staring at it. "You look like someone who hadn't learned to be afraid yet," I said. She nodded. That's exactly who she was. I miss her. I placed the photo gently back on the table. I think she's still here. She just needed someone to remind her. Later that evening, as the rain continued its soft drum beat against the roof, we moved to the piano again. This time, I sat at the bench while she curled up on the armchair nearby. I played a simple melody, one I'd made up on the spot, clumsy, unsure but heartfelt. She closed her eyes, listening, her foot tapping softly against the carpet. When I finished, she looked at me with a softness I hadn't seen before. "You know what scares me?" she said quietly. "It's not that this might not last. It's that it might. I don't know how to live in something real after pretending for so long." I didn't try to give her a speech. I just reached across the space between us and took her hand again. We sat like that, holding something fragile but growing stronger by the day. We were two people who had lived through different seasons of silence, now finally learning to speak again, with loud declarations or rehearsed lines. But through presence, through shared breath, through truth. And in that moment, with the smell of cinnamon and rain and the faint hum of connection hanging in the air, I understood something profound. Love doesn't always announce itself with fireworks or grand gestures. Sometimes it comes quietly, like a piano key pressed after years of stillness, or a journal page turned without fear, or a moment of eye contact that says without saying, "I see you. I see all of you. And I'm still here." The following week passed more slowly than I expected. Not because of anything bad, but because, for the first time in a long time, I wasn't just drifting through my days. Every interaction, every errand, every job I took seemed to exist in this kind of suspended state, something incomplete until I could see her again. She had gently suggested we give each other a little breathing room after sharing so much. Sometimes, when something's fragile, it needs a bit of stillness to take root, she had said. And while I understood her intention, that space only made me think of her more. Not out of desperation, but out of curiosity. Like, what else could we uncover? What else could bloom? When she finally texted me on a Tuesday morning, I felt the tension in my chest ease like a stretched string finally relaxing. Her message was short. "Come for dinner?" "I cooked something new. Hope it's not terrible." I replied with a thumbs Up and a see you at 7. The rest of my day was a blur of movement, trenching bolts loose from a stubborn server rack, rerouting cables, troubleshooting printers that seemed determined to test my patience. But underneath it all, I kept thinking about her in the kitchen, trying something new, waiting for me. That night, the moment she opened the door, the smell of roasted garlic, lemon, and rosemary drifted out, warm and comforting. She looked different again, not drastically, but like someone who had rested and remembered something she'd forgotten, that she could be soft without being weak, that she could open the door and not brace for pain. She was barefoot again, her hair tucked behind one ear, and she smiled like she meant it. "Don't judge my cooking," she said as I stepped inside. I watched 3 YouTube videos and still winged it. The table was already set with 2 plates, cloth napkins, even wine glasses. The effort she put into it wasn't lost on me. And even more than the meal, grilled chicken with lemon risotto and blistered green beans, what mattered was how we ate it. No distractions, no TV, no phones on the table. We ate slowly, between small stories and quiet laughs, like people learning the rhythm of each other's company. It wasn't a date. It wasn't not a date. It was simply shared time. That felt more intimate than anything else. After we cleared the plates and she shooed me away from helping with the dishes, we sat on the back patio. The rain had stopped earlier, and the air was thick with the smell of wet earth and cooling stone. She handed me a blanket without asking, just one of those instinctive gestures that meant she was paying attention. We sat under the string lights. She had hung months ago but rarely turned on. Tonight they glowed softly above us, like tiny stars that decided to stay close. We talked about silly things first, bad high school hairstyles, the weird way elevators make everyone act like strangers, the best gas station snacks. But then, as always with her, we found ourselves drifting into deeper waters. She told me about her ex-husband for the first time, not in bitterness or pain, but in clarity. How they met young, married for the wrong reasons, and spent years avoiding conversations that mattered. He was kind, she said, but we were 2 people trying to become versions of ourselves we didn't even like. I listened, not to offer solutions, but to make space. Then I told her about my dad, how he used to sketch out old buildings he wanted to restore, but never got the chance. How I used to sit beside him, copying his lines, wanting to be like him, even though I didn't understand what that meant yet. He was quiet, I said, but not cold. It's like someone who carried his stories in a locked drawer. She reached for my hand then, not dramatically, just a simple gesture of connection. Her fingers were warm, a little calloused, real. "Maybe we've both been quiet too long," she said, and I nodded. We sat like that for a long time, saying less and meaning more. The crickets began their nightly chorus. A distant dog barked once, and then fell silent. Somewhere in the neighborhood, wind chimes clinked faintly with each breeze. It felt like the world was shrinking down to just the 2 of us. No noise, no distractions, just her shoulder brushing mine, our legs touching beneath the blanket. The soft click of her glass as she set it down beside her. At some point, she leaned her head back and looked up at the lights. "Sometimes I think I spent the first half of my life learning how to disappear," she said. "And now, I want to learn how to stay here. With someone, I didn't know what to say to that. Not because I didn't feel the same, but because words felt too small for it. So I turned toward her, placed a hand on her cheek, and just held it there. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, everything else disappeared. It wasn't a kiss. Didn't need to be. It was presence. It was enough. Eventually, she stood and walked inside, returning with something in her hands, a small music box made of dark wood, worn at the edges. "My grandmother gave me this when I was 10, she said. "I used to wind it up and dance in the hallway when no one was watching. I haven't played it in years." She handed it to me, and I could feel the weight of history in it. I turned. The tiny brass key slowly, and when the tune started, soft and crackly, she closed her eyes and started to move. Not like a performance. Not like she needed an audience. Just swaying, barefoot on the patio stones, arms loosely around herself. Eyes closed to everything except the music and the memory. I watched Hurley, watched her hand. It felt like witnessing a page being turned in a book that had been stuck for years. When the music faded, she opened her eyes and looked at me. There was no need to explain what had just happened. Some moments carry their own clarity. Later, as I walked back to my car, I glanced over my shoulder and saw her standing in the doorway, hand on the frame, just watching. There was no goodbye, no see you soon, just a look. One that said, this isn't the end of the night, it's just a pause, a breath between pages. And as I drove home, I realized something. Love, when it's real, doesn't rush. It reveals. Bit by bit, day by day, and dance by forgotten dance. And in this slow unfolding, I was finally learning what it meant to see someone fully and let myself be seen in return. The days that followed unfolded like the quiet pages of a well-loved book. I kept working. Of course, client calls, laptop diagnostics, out network setups, but something had shifted beneath the surface. Every mundane task seemed to hum with a different energy, as if the silence between the clicks and cables had been rewired. It wasn't infatuation, at least not in the usual sense. It was more like the kind of calm you find after a storm has passed. When the earth smells cleaner and the air feels honest. She texted less that week, but the messages she did send were thoughtful, not rushed. Found this old book I loved when I was 20. Want to borrow it? Or I made that lemon chicken again? Still needs work. Short things. No pressure. And I found myself replying with the same energy, not chasing, not waiting, just being there, and maybe that was the difference. With her, I didn't feel like I had to perform. There was no act. Just presence. On Saturday, she called instead of texting. I was at the hardware store, searching for a rare part for an ancient PC tower, when her name flashed on my screen. "Hey," she said, voice soft and curious. "I know it's last minute, but do you want to go somewhere with me tonight?" I asked her where. She hesitated. "Not far, just trust me." By 7 p.m., I was in her driveway. Wearing the one collared shirt I owned that wasn't stained with motor oil or coffee, she stepped outside in a navy blue dress, not fancy, but flowing and soft like something meant for slow walks. Her hair was down, and she carried a tote bag slung over one shoulder. "No tools tonight," she teased, and I laughed, holding the car door open for her. We drove in near silence, soft music filling the space. She navigated us out of town and onto winding back roads until we reached an old overlooked spot I hadn't seen in years. The kind teenagers used to visit with contraband beer and big feelings. Now it was quiet, the kind of quiet that holds space instead of demanding attention. We climbed out and sat on the hood of the car, looking out over the rolling hills bathed in the last amber light of the sunset. She pulled a small thermos from her tote bag and poured us each a cup of hot tea. The steam curled between us, catching the golden light like smoke signals from a past life. "I used to come here when I was in college," she said. "When things felt too loud. I'd sit here for hours and try to remember who I was before all the roles got assigned daughter, student, wife, employee, ex-wife, caretaker." She paused, then looked at me. "You ever feel like life handed you a script you didn't audition for?" I nodded slowly. "Yeah, all the time. I just didn't know I was allowed to toss the script out." She smiled at that and sipped her tea. For a while, neither of us spoke. The wind whispered through the tall grass below, and the stars began to prick through the fading twilight. Then she reached into her bag again and pulled out an old Polaroid camera. "This thing still works," she said. "I thought maybe we could take one photo tonight. Just one. Not for social media, not for a frame. It's just for us." I agreed, and she stood in front of the car, waving me over. I joined her, and she set the timer, then stepped close. Her hand slipped into mine without hesitation, and we looked into the lens, not smiling, not posing, just being. The camera clicked word and spit out the photo. She grabbed it and tucked it back into her bag without even checking it. "We'll look at it one day," she said, "when it matters." Back in the car, we didn't head straight home. We detoured through side streets, past old playgrounds and shuttered diners, of course as if driving through memory lanes we didn't yet share. She told me about the first time she fixed a computer on her own, how proud she felt unscrewing the back panel and realizing she didn't need anyone else to show her how. I told her about the time I almost dropped out of tech school and the professor who told me, "You're not here to be perfect. You're here to be curious." When we finally reached her house, she didn't invite me in. Instead, she stood by the porch and leaned against the frame. "Tonight was nice," she said, and her voice had that same softness as the first night we met. "I didn't think I'd be someone who'd want to share this part of myself again, but here you are." I stepped forward, close enough to see the tiny flecks of silver in her hair under the porch light. "You don't have to explain," I said. "I see you." "Odd." And she reached up, brushing her fingers across my cheek, like she was memorizing the moment, and she stepped back inside, the door closing gently behind her, not with finality, but with the promise of return. That night, as I lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling and replayed everything. Not just the overlook or the tea or the photo, but the quiet courage it takes to let someone in when you've spent years learning to hide. I wasn't just falling for her. I was waking up to something bigger than either of us. Truth so simple. It had taken us a lifetime to say aloud. You don't need to be young to be new. And sometimes the most honest version of yourself is the one you show to someone who listens without trying to fix you. And I was listening. Always. The morning after. Our night at the Overlook came quietly, as if the world had paused to let me replay everything in my mind again before moving forward. There was a slowness to the air, the kind that made you feel like something important had just happened even if no one else knew it but you. I lingered longer in bed than usual, thinking about the photo tucked away in her bag, about the way her fingers had brushed my cheeks so gently, like she was trying to etch the shape of the moment into memory. And maybe she was. Maybe I was too. I didn't hear from her that day. No texts, no calls. And yet I didn't feel the usual panic that came with silence. I knew her now in a way I hadn't before. I understood the space she needed after sharing. Something real. It wasn't avoidance. It was processing. Letting things settle like snowflakes on still water. I went about my day, fixed a busted monitor for a client across town, had lunch at the diner, nodded to the usual faces. But everything felt quieter, like I was walking through the world with something fragile in my chest that I didn't want to disturb. Around 4 p.m. I got a message from her. Just 3 words. "Want to walk?" I replied immediately, telling her I'd be there in 15. When I arrived at her house, she was waiting out front in sneakers and a light hoodie, her hair pulled back but loose around her face. She looked comfortable, unguarded. And something about that hit me harder than any red lipstick or perfume ever could. We walked side by side, saying little at first. Our feet found rhythm with the leaves scattered across the sidewalk. The sun was dipping lower, casting long shadows behind us. Eventually, we found ourselves at the small lake on the edge of the neighborhood. It wasn't much, just a still patch of water, surrounded by old trees and a broken bench, but it felt like the kind of place where thoughts could land without interruption. She sat first, brushing some leaves off the bench before patting the space beside her. I sat down slowly, not touching, not speaking yet. We just looked out over the water. A few ducks drifted lazily near the edge, and far off a group of kids were skipping stones. She finally spoke. "I had a dream last night," she said. "We were sitting in this exact spot, but it wasn't today. It felt like years from now. Same lake, same bench, but older." We looked older. Still quiet, still comfortable, still us. A little nervous. "Isn't that silly? Dreaming of something so specific?" I turned to her. "Not silly. Maybe it's your heart telling you something your mind hasn't caught up with yet." She looked at me then, and there was that same vulnerability I'd seen in her the first day we met, buried behind the guarded lines of her face. But this time, there was no hesitation. She reached for my hand, weaving her fingers between mine. "I didn't think I'd get this far," she admitted. "With anyone." I didn't ask her what she meant. I didn't need to. The meaning was. In the silence that followed, in the way her grip tightened slightly, like she was afraid I might pull away. But I didn't. I stayed right there with her. The conversation drifted from there, like the ducks on the lake. She told me about her favorite book growing up, how she used to sneak away from her family during holidays to read in the attic. I told her about how I once tried to build my own computer at 15 and accidentally fried the motherboard and cried for 2 days because I thought I'd ruined my future. We laughed at ourselves, but gently, like the past was something we could forgive. At some point, the wind picked up, cool and sharp. She scooted closer, leaning her head against my shoulder. And I don't know if it was the stillness or the timing or the fact that everything finally felt so profoundly simple, but I turned slightly and pressed a kiss to the top of her head. Not rushed, not hungry, just grateful. We didn't speak much. After that, the sun sank, casting everything in a dusky, orange glow. When it was time to go, we walked back the way we came, hand in hand. There was no awkwardness, no questions needing answers, just a quiet understanding that we'd crossed another line together, something invisible and powerful. Back at her front porch, we lingered. She turned to me, her expression unreadable for a moment, then said, "You've made me believe in starting again." I didn't respond right away. I just looked at her, memorizing the way her eyes softened when she spoke those words. Then I leaned in, not a question this time, not a moment needing permission, and kissed her. It was gentle, warm, and when we pulled back, neither of us said a thing. We just smiled, quietly, like we'd both just remembered something we'd forgotten years ago that night. I didn't sleep right away. I stayed up, not overthinking, just feeling. It wasn't just about her. It was about what she brought out in me: patience, calm, a depth I didn't know I had the capacity to reach. She didn't need me to save her. She just needed someone who saw her, and I saw her. Truly, the days that followed moved in a rhythm I hadn't known before. It was neither hurried nor hesitant. It was grounded. Every morning, I'd wake up and find her in some small corner of my thoughts, sometimes in the first light slipping through my blinds, sometimes in the way a coffee mug warmed my hands. It wasn't infatuation anymore. It wasn't the thrill of the unexpected. It was something deeper, something earned. A connection that had grown roots while we weren't even looking. She invited me over that Saturday. Not because something was broken or because she needed help, but simply because she wanted me there. When I arrived, she was barefoot in the garden, tending to some potted herbs. There was dirt on her cheek and a smudge on her collar, and I had never seen anything more disarming. She looked up, smiled like she'd been waiting all morning, and simply said, "You're here." We didn't have plans. No tasks or repairs. Just the day ahead of us, and all it could become. We spent the morning in her kitchen. She cooked while I leaned against the counter, offering to help every few minutes, only to be shooed away with a flick of her towel. She moved with quiet ease, humming softly to a jazz record that crackled from an old speaker near the fridge. I asked her about her childhood. She told me about summer camps and her mother's homemade bread and the time she fell out of a tree trying to impress a boy. I asked if it worked. She shrugged and laughed. He cried harder than I did. I think that says enough. Over lunch, we talked about the future, on the way couples often do. No bullet points, no expectations, just possibilities. She mentioned wanting to travel, maybe take a course in photography. I told her I'd always wanted to learn to surf, despite having lived nowhere near the ocean. She looked at me with that half grin and said, "Well then, I guess we'll have to find a beach." After we ate, we moved to the living room. She curled up on the couch with her feet tucked under. Her and I sat beside her, close enough that our arms touched, but still giving her space to lean in if she wanted to, and she did. Eventually, she rested her head on my shoulder, sighing with the kind of release that only comes when you're fully at ease. She reached for a photo album on the table and opened it slowly. Inside were pictures I hadn't seen before, moments she'd kept tucked away, her as a teenager, laughing with braces and wide eyes. Her on her wedding day, beautiful but unsure. Her holding a baby girl, her daughter, the one who now lived across the country. She told me about each photo, her voice steady but filled with all the weight and warmth of a life fully lived. Not perfect, but real. There was one picture that made her pause. It was of her alone, maybe in her early 30s, standing by a lake with wind in her hair. She stared at it for a long moment, then said, "That's the last time I remember feeling like I knew myself, before everything got complicated." I looked at her then not as someone who needed saving or reassurance, but as someone who had made it through every storm and still managed to bloom. I told her, "You're still her. You've just grown more layers, like a tree with stronger rings." She didn't cry. She didn't need to. Her fingers slipped into mine and held tight, and that said more than any tears could. Later, as the sun lowered into the gold of early evening, we sat on her porch again. The air was quiet, filled only with the rustle of leaves and distant laughter. From a neighbor's yard, she leaned into me and whispered, "I never thought I'd be here again. Not just with someone, but with myself. I feel like I finally came back." I kissed her temple and said nothing, because I knew she didn't need words. She just needed presence. And I was there fully, willingly. When I left that night, it wasn't with the ache of parting. It was with the comfort of knowing I'd return in. So would she. We weren't rushing. We weren't labeling. But we were building something with every quiet moment. Every look that held more than a sentence ever could. Weeks turned into months. And though I still took on computer repair jobs, my visits to her home became less about fixing and more about being. Her daughter flew in once, surprised to find a younger man seated at her mother's table, laughing over morning coffee. There was some hesitation at first, naturally, but over time she saw what I saw, someone who had found joy again. Someone who deserved it. One evening, as winter softened into spring, we took a walk through the same trail where we first shared silence. Back when we were strangers, dancing around honesty, she stopped beneath the tall sycamore tree near the creek and turned to face me. "You know what the scariest thing was?" she asked. "Not being seen? Not really? For years I played roles, mother, wife, boss, friend, but I stopped letting anyone look beyond the script. You were the first person who just sat with me. No expectations, no rush." I brushed a strand of hair from her cheek and said, "You were always there. You just needed someone to remind you." She smiled, and in that moment, the woman I met all those months ago, the one with guarded eyes and a flickering curiosity, was gone. In her place stood someone whole. I knew as I looked at her that I wasn't just part of her story. She was part of mine. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.